Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Unresolved Textual Tension. You may be wondering, why isn't Maria or Katie doing this intro? Well, that's because we have Budget Katie today. Say hello, Budget Katie.
Hi guys, hi everyone. I'm your sub for the day. My name is Lindberg, for those of you who don't know me.
And Lindberg is a friend of mine who was already on the Shogun episode, if anybody watched that, which statistically from the view count, nobody did. She's also my co-host on my A Song of Ice and Fire channel, which has 40 subscribers now, 10 more, and we get to do live streams.
Wow.
We also do a reread section there. She is also a dark fantasy girly, and so this series, the first of which we're doing today, is one of her favorites, or just one you really like?
It's one I really like. I wouldn't say it's a favorite.
We're doing The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. Another thing to note about Lindbergh is that there's kind of a bit of a delay, so you guys will notice this probably more on the live stream than on the edited version, where I'll just cut it out. So if we talk over each other, pay more attention to me. I'm the man. I'm the one who's like more important here. Lindbergh's like, she's gonna take second. That didn't lag. Okay, we're doing Joe Abercrombie's The Blade Itself. Do you want to give like a short idea of the premise, and then we'll go into our initial views?
The premise is basically that we have three main characters. We have Glokta, who is a former very famous swordsman who was captured in the last war and tortured for many years, and now he's returned to his home country called the Union, and he works as an inquisitioner for the Grand Inquisition, which is basically their police force. They torture people and they extract money. Then we have Giselle, the foppish, young, dashing lord who loves himself more than anything in the world, who has lived a life of luxury and is kind of struggling to find himself. And when we first meet him, he is training for a tournament, a very renowned tournament, where they fence for the glory of the winner. And our last main character is Logan. He is a northern barbarian from the savage north who is headed south. He's running away from his former king for reasons we do not know yet. And he meets up with a wizard.
He meets up with a wizard, and I would say that's the main plot, but this book has kind of a problem where it doesn't necessarily have a main plot that defines the book as a whole. Like, there's kind of a thread, but it's a little bit less cohesive in that way than some other books you're probably used to. And to go into it for a minute, I had read a Joe Abercrombie book before this. It was Best Served Cold, which I remember being like, this is like well written, but this is not vibing with me. It's like kind of like a little depressing, honestly. And like I was always like, okay, but I'd be willing to try one of his other books. They seem interesting, and everybody talks very highly of them. And one thing to note is that this came out in 2006, The Blade Itself. So this was his first book, and it's also, I think, came out during a very like grim dark era in fantasy, and this was like, and so this kind of falls into that. I think this is how Abercrombie wants to write, so he wasn't really just chasing a trend. But it is worth pointing out that I think a lot of this is very much a product of its time period as well, in terms of who was getting into dark fantasy and writing at that time.
Abercrombie wasn't chasing a trend. It's just that Martin kind of blew the door open for Grimdark books, and people realized that, oh, we can publish this and it will sell. People want to read it. So that's how Abercrombie got a foot in. He had actually pitched this book and sent it out to multiple publishers before and gotten rejections, until Gollancz finally picked it up. It's
one of those cases where, like, the market finds people who are already doing the thing more than the market creates someone to do the thing, a la Fourth Wing, where the other has specifically said, they were like, hey, why don't you write a fantasy? And then all suffered because
and we all know how that went.
We read this for the book club, which is our Patreon book club. Lindbergh, actually, how would you, because my mother says I have to do these way earlier in the video, how would you sell our Patreon to people?
Why do you ask me to do it? Well, I'm just the sub. This is very unfair of you. I don't actually know all the tiers. Seriously. Okay. I just know which one I'm in.
All right. Okay, we have 3 tiers. We have the official Patreon tier, which gets you access to the Discord. It has many lovely, funny, sexy people in it, like Lindbergh. And then we have the book club tier, which is this is a book club book pick where you guys voted on it and we read it. And there's a live stream at the end of the month where we pay attention to your comments, even if I don't always click on them and show them on screen. And in our final tier, we have the critique tier, which is where me and Katie once a month, not this Katie, a different Katie, the normal Katie, and we go over a chapter and look at the prose and the and the little writing, and also and that's our final tier. But then also, if you're interested, again, me and Lindbergh have our own channel where we're doing more A Song of Ice and Fire stuff, where we do basically the same thing me and Katie do in the critique tier, but for a chapter of A Song of Ice and Fire, and we also started to reread it with it, like some other cool, funny, good-looking people. So, go ahead. I'll probably start putting that link in the description if you're interested in that, and check out our Patreon. If you can't do that, like and comment on this video. It actually really does help, and it's a little bit of restitution for you not actually joining our Patreon. Okay, so my overimpressions of this book were, I think Abercrombie is very talented, but I have two big kind of umbrella of my problems in it. And I do think he does certain things very well, and I'll get to those later. I think the first umbrella of problems I have fall under new book-itis and genre expectations, in that I feel like the structure and the pacing is a little clunky, and also there are certain scenes that are like, okay, this is just a new author kind of problem. And then the way he conveys his worldview, I don't love. I don't think it's necessarily a huge problem, but I didn't jive with it in certain ways, and we'll discuss that as we go. There's something about it that I think is a little bit juvenile in a way that maybe, or expresses a bit of a juvenile point of view that I think may mature over time. I haven't read a lot of his later books, but I know a lot of the new book-itis problems I noticed less in Best Served Cold, even though I liked that book less, but like his craft has definitely improved. What were your feelings about it, Lindbergh? Because this is your third time reading this?
I don't actually know. I'm a notorious reader of books, for those of you who don't know. So I will read a book that I like to death until the book literally splits and falls apart. So I don't actually know. I am a rather big Abercrombie fan. I read all of his books, and I'll be the first to agree that this book does have new author syndrome. You can just tell that the author had a lot of ideas, and he has a lot of fun quips he wanted to put in the book. He is talented, but he did not know when to edit himself. He did not really know how to pace himself. He did not know which scenes were pivotal, and he didn't really know how to write a plot that drove these character interactions that are very good, but it becomes very meandering. There are no cohesive plot arcs. And at one point where it feels like the story is about to start rolling, the book ends. By the time we get a promise for the plot of the book ends. And I'll be the first to say that this isn't a perfect book, but I enjoy it immensely. I have fun with it. It makes me laugh. If you write a book and it makes me laugh, you know, you're good. You're good. You're gonna have to do something very bad to make me hate you.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the split opinions about this book, is that it either succeeds or fails in kind of the grace notes of like the humor and the character interactions. And if that works for you, the book is kind of worth it because it'll succeed in those respects. And if you don't jive with it, which it's a very specific kind of tone and humor and worldview, then you're just gonna hate the book. And I think that kind of is one of the big problems, and well, they're just one of the big divides in the book. I don't think again, those kind of grace notes worked for me. I also just have a very low tolerance for long books, and I think this is something where maybe it's a genre expectation of fantasy books, the first book never goes anywhere. Like we just finished Shadow of the Gods, or we posted it, and the title was 17 Hours of Prologue, which is how I feel about that book. You can just skip it entirely, and you will get all the information you need in the second book, I'm pretty sure. And so there may be an extent to which he didn't feel like a need to light a fire under him to get to the plot very quickly, because he was like, no, this is normal. Whereas like in Best Served Cold, like that book starts, that book has a plot, it gets going, it has that keystone at the end. Yeah, I think we'll see. There may be some pistolas or hand crossbolas or Gurkish firearm stolas pulled, but
this episode might mark the end of our friendship. This might be the last thing you see of us two together.
well, you know, the thing is, we always try to model good discussion and disagreement on this podcast.
I do think that the genre convention of writing a trilogy makes it hard, especially for new authors, to really get a move on and feel that pressure to make the plot start rolling. You see so many people fall into the trap of front loading. They just dump all their world building on you straight away, and the characters kind of just go around about their lives and nothing really happens. So you can really tell the difference in his standalone books from this first trilogy book. In the standalones, you can tell that he set out with a small contained story, and he was like, I have to fit this story into this page count. Whereas in this first book, it's like, I have all these interactions I want to write about. I want Glockter to do these quips. I want Logan to be baffled by the city. And I want Giselle to be empty-headed and vain. And that's pretty much what we do all book. And I read Russian classics. I love the telenovela style. Just let the characters talk. I want to hear what they think. I want to follow along. I want to see what blunders they get into. So this is up my alley. And I fully respect that it won't be up anyone's alley. Like, if you actually want the book to accomplish much, I understand why you don't like it.
I think that also speaks to the characters a little bit, in that, like, for example, I really enjoyed Giselle's chapters. I actually could probably have listened to him go on for a really long time, whereas with the other two, I didn't really like their chapters as much, and so the meandering quality kind of was more of a problem. One of the things is we recently, again, reread the first part of A Game of Thrones, and, like, that book starts so fast. And that's something that I don't think is, like, necessarily people realize so much, as like, as a fantasy epic. I think that's why sometimes people are like, oh, it doesn't feel like fantasy, is just because it actually just starts really quickly.
Some people like to compare this to A Game of Thrones, which I think is a terrible mistake. It is not at all the same thing.
I'll make a few comparisons just because I do think they do certain things differently.
I have a fly, sorry. I'm Swedish. We have flies in Sweden. At some point, you might see my pink fly swatter appear.
No, they don't have screens on their windows, which here in Florida, you would just be inundated with malaria. If you
Some people do. Some smart people do. I'm just not smart.
Something people don't know about Lindbergh, she is like a farm girl, so she can get stuff done. Let's get a Rosie the Riveter pose, maybe for the thumbnail. Okay, perfect. You can't see
my
it in
arms
the
are
live
too
stream
long.
version.
Yeah, my arms are too long.
So what is it that you think, because before we get into it, that you really, like, if you were to make a case for what you like about the book and what it does well, what would that be?
Joe Abercrombie is really good at getting into his characters' heads and figuring out what makes them tick. And then he is good at writing interactions between characters that allows the character to express themselves. He's good at writing quippy dialogue. It's a dialogue where people wouldn't talk like this in real life, but it's quick, it's snappy, everyone is somewhat witty, it's very upfront. And I think he has a flair for using comedy in an exaggerated way until it becomes almost a parody of what he wants to talk about. So that is some of the juvenile things that you talked about, I think. He has a way of writing nobility. They're like mustache-twirling idiots, all of them. And that is, I feel, like a comedic comedic method to talk about structural corruption, to talk about social classes in a way that makes it funny and, for some people, more easily digestible. It's like, it's British humor. Everything is shit and then you die. Haha. It's Monty Python.
Yeah, it's that I think is true. It didn't work great for me, but we'll get into that more in terms of the granularity. But okay, so how does the book start?
The book starts with Logan. We see him fighting something he called Shenka, or flatheads. And he is grappling, and then he rolls off the edge of a cliff. And that is where we start. He ends up on the bottom. He is all alone. He has lost his friends. And basically he has a little sit down with his pot, because he's a big dumb northern man who has no friends anymore. And he just thinks to himself that, oh, I would really like to go home. How good it would be to see my family, my friends, my wife. But they're all dead.
So what happens is that Logan wanders around for a good 4 or 5 chapters in this book before getting to like his plot moment. And this is one of the places that I felt the new bookitis, and that this feels almost like a character exploration for that Abercrombie wrote on his own. And then like he should have just rewritten it in a faster manner, but he kind of just left it in. Because it really is like him not interacting with other characters. There are moments I like, so like his interest in his pot as his one friend is funny, and it's also like a little bit of the subversion of, and that's the thing about this book, is it's trying to subvert a lot of fantasy like tropes and views. And so it's like, oh, he is a very archetypal character that you feel like Abercrombie kind of wants to subvert, but I don't think it really works. You can talk more about it in a little bit, but to me, part of the problem is that the voice the narrator does for him is very just like middle-class English. He doesn't sound like a barbarian. He just sounds very plain and normal, and so like for me it didn't quite hit.
How does a barbarian sound, Will?
Hello, my name is Logan Nine Fingers. No, but like more like a deep growly, I would imagine, even if not necessarily like a, you know, a Norwegian accent or something, or a Scottish accent, because that's always what people go to. But it felt like a little bit like he just felt kind of plain. He didn't really talk like it. One of the things we'll talk about is with Giselle is that Giselle's chapters just ring, and his narration rings with his character. Like, he's such an arrogant, vapid person. It's hilarious. And, like, that is reflected in the prose. And, like, I would have liked more if that had been integrated into how Logan thinks. To me, he just felt like kind of a country yokel and not, like, a pseudo-Norse barbarian. And the other problem is that he is a very sort of static character. He basically, like, talks to some spirits, and some spirits are like, hey, you should go see this wizard. He's going to come to see you. And Logan's like, okay, bet. And I'm going to do that. And then I'm not going to ask the wizard where we're going or what we're doing. I'm just going to follow him. And like, I feel like this could have worked in a kind of like, I'm a broken man who has no motivation left. I'm just, you know, drinking and making it through life or something like that kind of a thing. But I didn't really feel that immediacy to his character.
No, I think you're right. Logan's introduction into the book is terrible. There is no sense of direction, and there is no real sense of why he's doing this. Why did he just, after losing his friends, just assume they're dead and then wander around for chapters until some spirits said to go to a wizard? And there is a good reason for this. Having read the entire trilogy, I know why all of this happens. But the narrative does not convey that to us. And it also, with him just wandering around alone, doesn't really allow to flesh out his character, because, as Will says, he just comes off as a bit of a nothing, and Logan is very much not a nothing character, and really pushing his interactions straight away, I feel, would allow him to express his personality, because he has this kind of, he is a barbarian subversion, So you have this expectations of barbarians to be big and grunty, as Will said, and kind of Nordic barbarian-esque, like very simple, very crude. But Logan is a very drawn back. He's very collected. He's very self-aware and sort of self-deprecating, and that does not really come off until he starts interacting with other people. And also, it is not until he interacts with other people that we start to hear and understand a little bit of what he's running from. Why is he just wandering around?
I think that's true. And like once he starts interacting with other people, like the most interesting part I found of his plotline was once he actually meets the wizard who's called Baez. Because like, okay, I'm kind of interested in what's happening with the plot here. We start getting into the fact that Logan has a very bloody reputation in the North. And what does that actually mean? Because now he's interacting with Northmen who like turned on him, and now he's considered a traitor to them. And that was like kind of, I just realized my shirt is doing a weird thing. I don't have a hunchback, guys. I thought it was like, that was the part where I was like, and also we were beginning to get some lore into the book, because again, he gets to like a little village where there's Baez and a couple of other people, and the wizard's like very like, oh, I'm a little funky and witty, and like, but there's a plan going on. And like, he also, Logan kind of makes friends with like the wizard's apprentice, who's kind of like a nerd, and like, that was nice. Like, those are good character beats and good interactions, and even if he still was a little passive in that regard, he is still doing something.
Would you say we could have just started Logan's story there when he arrives at the tower?
Yeah, we really could have. And that actually, I think, would have been almost like a funny subversion of the fantasy classic, is just the barbarian immediately showing up. And everyone being like, why did you come all this way? And then he meets the wizard, and like, and that would have been kind of, that A would have made him a little bit more active, and B would have been kind of like, okay, we skipped all that.
Yeah, and he would kind of sort of tease the little mystery of, how did you just show up here? It's in the middle of nowhere. What are you doing? Who are you?
Yeah, exactly. And like, I'm sure there's going to be something with his band of barbarians that he was with before this that he thinks are dead but aren't. And then we get, throughout the plot line, we get their viewpoints, and I could not figure out what the point of it was. This is, again, a thing where, like, yeah, where I was like, okay, I know they're going to become important in later books, but I feel like this is something where, like, Abercrombie wrote it, and then an editor should have been like, this is very nice, but is actually not needed.
Yeah, what is the point?
Yeah, what are we doing here? And so one of the big plot lines here is that after that Baez to Logan is like, okay, I got this quest we got to go on, but first we gotta the king of the Northmen, Herod, I think is his name. Bethod. She's taking the role of Maria here.
Bethod and his sons Scale and Calder. That is also another good point, because first Calder just shows up alone, and they send him off, and then they just sit around and wait for Bethod to show up himself.
I kind of get it in that it's like you build up to a thing, but it's kind of like also like a little bit like are you okay? Oh, fly swatter time. Smart.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, and like I did find Bethod interesting. I always liked the kind of barbarian king archetype. There was also that in Kushiel's Dart, which is a book we read that I really liked. And here you get that, like, okay, the barbarian clans had a bunch of wars, and they used to be clans, and now Bethod has made them into one war host, and basically to keep his power, he's going to go fight the North, or not the North, the Union. Down south. And like, I actually kind of liked that, because it's pointed out at one point that like his motivation is basically that he needs a way to legitimize his power. And that's the thing people really don't realize about warfare in a medieval period, is that warfare is a really good way of legitimizing your power and proving that, like, hey, everybody follows me, you all see each other, bonds are formed, but also they're under my keep. And also, like, a la Roose Bolton in A Song of Ice and Fire, maybe I can put the people I don't like in the initial line of battle so they all die. And so, like, I like that as a motivation. I do think that's a part where the book is a little bit smarter than just like, oh, evil barbarians are evil. It's like, no, they have a political angle. And I actually liked in general that the barbarians are kind of portrayed as like, oh, we are doing things for recognizable motivations.
This is actually rather interesting because as someone who has read the entire trilogy, I know a little more of the context of what the scene is also trying to tease to you and set up. Because there is like a bigger sphere outside of the conversation they have that that Abercrombie is trying to drip to you, like, oh, and there is something bigger going on, because you have these rather cryptic questioning between Bethod and why do I think Canadius? Byers, yes. Oh, their names are so similar. And Byers, where Bethod is like, "Are you on my side, Byers?" And Byers is like, "Yes. No, actually, I just lied to you." And knowing what Abercrombie is trying to do outside of the obvious, where he actually gives some reasonable context for why Bethod is doing this, and Bethod coming off as kind of a reasonable, intelligent person, he's trying to foreshadow, and I think the foreshadowing could have been better executed. I'm sorry. Also, did I get comment clicking privileges?
No, sorry. I need to upgrade for $15 a month, and I didn't really quite think they were worth it.
Oh, the woman. Can you click Ben?
I actually like the B plot with Logan's barbarian friends because I liked the history and world building around Bethod, and the rest of the characters really had no interaction with that.
I just want to say that I too like Logan's friends. Except it is not really their inclusion, it's that their inclusion doesn't bring anything to the book in terms of context, world building, plot development. Because while it offers some interesting character interactions, some funny moments, and just a way to get to know them, they don't accomplish anything except getting Foley dead. And since we don't know Foley, we don't know what they're doing, we don't really know who they went in to talk to or what it means, his death has no plot impact. So I think there would be a way to write them into this story, but they would have to do something if they're going to be in here. Right now, they're just fluff, and they could be cut. We could meet them in the next book, and nothing would change.
Yeah, completely. That was my feeling as well. It's like, you keep them existing in the world, but we just don't need to see them in this book. Even what happens in this book with their little band feels like it could probably just happen in book 2, in like if you shortened it a little bit. And like I actually did like Forley dying, actually, because I actually felt like that sold, and their interaction sold, the idea of the world-weary barbarians better than Logan, because like there's a part basically in their storyline is basically like, oh, Logan's gone, okay, that sucks. We come across this village that got murdered. It was by Bethod's taxman. They kill a child, or not a child, one of the soldiers is a child, and they're like, yeah, we can't leave you behind, this is a difficult choice to make, but they kill him. And then Forley, who was the like weakest of them, tries to go and be brave in a way that none of the rest of them really had the opportunity to. Forley dies because of Bethod, and then they're like, okay, we're gonna go join the Anglanders to fight against Bethod, because fuck that guy. But I actually really liked the Forley dying, because it was a moment of like of heroism in this world that otherwise feels so myopic. One of the big differences, I think, between A Song of Ice and Fire and this book is that, you know, A Song of Ice and Fire is often you know, credited or whatever with being very grimdark and real, and that's true, but Martin has a underlying, he's an underlying, all that is he's a romantic, and so that's in small parts of the book, and this is one moment that kind of reminded me of that, in that they loved, or not loved, but like Forley was a good person, and they valued the kind of strength he had, and like just in terms of the book, it was like a bright moment of like, oh, there is something in this world. But again, in terms of plot, it kind of loops around and isn't super important.
We could pretty much just have that moment of them. We could write all of their POVs into one interaction, like, oh, Logan is gone, what do we do? This village is here, we need information, why is everyone dead, what is happening? And then they could send Foley in, and also where they send him in and who he talks to could be a little more clearly put, so we understand even more what it actually means. Because they send him into the camp of Bethod's son, who just kills him for reasons unknown. So basically, their own king, the son of their own king, just killed one of his own people. So I feel like there could be more context.
Yeah, and I actually feel like Forley going into the camp should have been a scene. That's actually like a delicious kind of like tension of like, I'm going in here, I don't know what's going to happen, and then he dies at the end. Like, but you also would get more interaction with Bethod as a king and know him a little bit better. And like, I feel like that could have been really juicy instead of just him dying.
Instead of getting their POVs from the Dogman, we could get them for Foley. He could become like a person to us even more.
Yeah.
He could think about his position in the group as someone who was just... Because they are together as a band because they... during Bethod's war against the clans, when he tried to unite them, because they were much like the Old North before Sweden, basically warlords rule the lands, called Jarls. And what Bethod did is he said, I'm going to be a king. I'm going to subjugate all of you. And with Logan as his champion, he went around and offered them to duel. And duels are very sacred to Northmen because it's a measurement of strength between men. They respect strength. And what Foley's village offered up their weakest combatant as a means of saying that they surrendered to Bethod without a fight. So that is why Foley is called the weakest. So we could basically have Foley's POV be all about his place in a group of notable, formidable fighters, where he is just there as a kind of token character. He could be fighting to feel like he is part of it, like he has something to offer them in this time where strength is direly needed. When they're fighting flatheads, they're running for their lives because the king wants them dead. And then we could have him do this brave thing for the betterment of everyone, and then it backfires. That would be more impactful than them wandering around the woods until they happen upon a village, I feel.
No, I agree entirely. I think instead of the Dogman, this should have been from Forley's point of view. And I think that would have actually sold, again, the subversion of the fantasy tropes a little better, in that he's a barbarian of the North, but he's a weak barbarian. But at the end, his strength that his band will recognize in book 2 was one of the heart, of the spirit. And again, you get like just better scenes from it, and it actually kind of feels very grimdark that he dies at the end, but still has an impact.
And I think from his point of view, someone like Black Dow would pop even more, because Black Dow is quite the infamous character. And Dogman is just generally unimpressed by everyone. So I think through Foley's eyes, we could get even more chemistry from the characters to kind of latch onto and see that, oh, these people care, because right now they're a bit of nothing. You know, you don't really care about them.
Yeah, and the thing is, it also would play into, I think, because Forley needs them essentially to survive, because this is his profession in a weird way, is this band of people. That's how he stays fed. And because that's one thing I actually quite liked about when they have to kill the young soldier after they find the village murdered, and they're like, you murdered all these villagers, because they already killed the other soldier. And then he's like, I didn't have a choice. I had to be here. And they're like, okay, but we still have to kill you. And he's like, no, I had no choice in getting to this point. And he kind of explains it. And one of the other characters is like, we know. And there's this moment of like, yeah, they understand how grim and non of your own choices this decision was made, but we also, out of our own choices, can't leave you alive here right now. And like that, to me, again, that was a really interesting, like, oh, this world is unheroic in the way, and it's practical. It's a practical unheroicism that I really liked.
Yeah, it comments on how war sweeps up people and put them in situations where impossible choices have to be made. It's not a choice you made. You just served the wrong man who decided that this is how it's going to be. And that is impactful. It's a hard scene because you can tell that they didn't want to do this, but they had to. and that sets the tone.
Yeah, I would have liked more of that from Logan. Like that's the thing is I wanted his storyline to be more like that. Like so when the wizard's apprentice comes and finds him, there's he faces a point where it's like they're out of food, they got to make 40 miles. The guy is sick, he can't walk. They don't even really have enough water and he looks at him and is like the simple math of this, the cold equation is that like we can't get there on the water we have. I have to leave you behind. And he's thinking about like, oh, there's all these ways that I've left people behind in the past, and you think like, okay, he's gonna leave him behind, and that's like a hardcore thing to do, but he really doesn't have a choice, so it's not cruel exactly. And then he just picks him up and carries him, and like that to me felt like a little bit of a cheat of like you set up this character in this really difficult position, and then he just got out. And I understand there's a certain amount of escalation in that he probably wanted Logan to start in a more heroic mold and then kind of reveal over time. I'm assuming like in later books. More of that will be stripped away till he becomes the Nine Fingers again. But I didn't really get that from this book.
Yeah. Most of Logan's character development happens in the next book, which is rather unfortunate because he is a very distinct character. And as you say, why did we go through all of this this internal dialogue and all of these thoughts only to pick him up and carry him? Why just... I don't understand why we did it that way.
There's another barbarian character trying to do well in Best Served Cold. I forget what his name is. I think like Shivers? I don't remember.
Yeah, Shivers.
And he starts off trying to be good, and by the end of the book, he is relapsed into like just...
He gets broken. Damn it, that book just destroys him. Oh.
Yeah, and there were moments in that book that I really liked his journey along that, and that he joins up with Monza
Mercato.
Right, who's on a roaring range of revenge, and he like joins up with her, and like he loses an eye at one point because it was a scene that like, again, I feel like does the thing this book wants to do but better, where they get captured by the bad guys and start getting tortured, and they take out the guy's eye, and then the bad guy is like, oh wait, I actually, no, they're on my side, I didn't want you to do that, but like it's too late. That already happened.
Sorry, dude. Let's just forget about it. What can I say? Shit happens.
In another book, they would have gotten close, but then not done it. But in this book, it's like, okay, no, sometimes weird shit happens in life, and that makes him darker. And the main character, Monza, is like, by the end, she doesn't really want him to like her that much, and like he's become this horrible thing that's almost like more of a weight on her.
He's kind of trauma bonded to her.
Yeah, exactly. And in a way, and I liked that subversion in that book. Again, I find that book to be a little myopic as a whole for me. I think this is a problem with the new book Itis, is that he didn't, by the time he gets to Best Served Cold, he's already done this with Logan's character, I'm assuming, more in the later books. And so, like, he knew how to do a faster version of that, basically. And so that's kind of my problem, because Logan just doesn't do a lot in this book.
No, we could just cut him to where he shows up at Bias's tower. We don't really have to have him save the apprentice, because that bond between him and the apprentice also doesn't really end up meaning that much in the end. Because he thinks that, oh, this is the first man I've saved. I've saved one man this year and I've killed 4. That puts me on the up as far as I see it. And Joe is trying to build up that, oh, you know, he's a bad guy, this dude. At some point they say he's killed more men than Winter, which is a great line. But you could just give us that, and he could save the apprentice at a later time. It doesn't have to be a long sort of prologue until he meets the wizard and the story actually starts. And he's also more likable when Bias is kind of poking fun at him.
Yeah, he is, because it's a little bit more of a mismatch of personality. In general, this book I felt like all the characters feel a little... There's a lacking of emotional depth to them, not in terms of how they act, but in terms of how it's written. In that, like, I would have liked him to be more of a mess. I think there's at one point a point where he talks about, like, all I really know is violence, but, like, also that's all I'm really good for. And I kind of would have liked that almost more if, like, he kind of meditated on the fact that Baez just wants him because he's good at killing things. But the thing is, that isn't why Baez wants him. Baez wants him because he can talk to spirits. And so like I didn't feel like that came
Yeah,
through
you're
quite.
right.
Yeah, it would have been kind of interesting, I think, if there had been
That
a
would have
kind of
been
like.
so much nicer as well, because that would really feed off his. He has a really toxic inner voice that says that, you know, he is worthless. He's just a crude brute who kills people. His life is built on a pile of corpses, and Bias wanting him for this purpose would kind of allow us to play on that in his internal dialogue as he kind of processes that, you know, I was running away from this. I wanted to be a better man. And here I am with this wizard falling back into my old habits. That would be a stronger way to kind of tease his backstory than just the randomness that we get.
I think even you could have something where, again, I think you go either way. I think either, yeah, he's going there for violence, or even the spirits tell him he like wizard is looking for you, and he's like he probably wants me to kill people, and the spirits are like, no, actually he wants you for like another purpose, and that could give him the impetus to go, oh, I want to. This is an opportunity for me to change, to be somebody who's not just a hired sword. Who, and like then throughout the series he can backslide, as I'm assuming he's going to. So I feel like either way to go would be at a little bit more. Basically, you want characters to be active and to kind of have an arc, and he isn't very active, because what happens is basically they meet Bethod. Bethod's like, okay, well I'm still gonna attack. And then him and Baez, Logan and Baez, basically leave the north. They have to kill people. There's a nice scene where Logan has to kill a guy who like he knew beforehand who was a barbarian, which is a scene I really liked. I was like, oh, this is a good way of engaging with Logan's backstory. And then basically they sail to Adua. And this is where they sort of interact with the other characters. Adua is like the main big city in the center of the world. That's the
It is the
capital
capital of the Union, which is a union between several different countries: England, Midland, Starikland, and a couple of more places I can't remember the name of.
They're British. That's like their thing. They're like British, but almost a little bit in
Actually,
like.
England is British coded. It's a dreary, miserable place everyone wants to escape from. It's basically a prison colony. I think Adua and Midland is supposed to be vaguely Spanish-Italian inspired. And it's like, or France, it's like the epitome of culture in their own opinion, and the most enlightened, most civilized place, which at this time in the world would be Central Europe.
Yeah, Ben says they're British, but also the Holy Roman Empire. Yeah, I got a little bit of like a German flair from them, but that may be because I'm too into Warhammer. They're okay. So, and the people that start out in Adua are Giselle and Glokta, and we actually start with Glokta. Do you want to describe who Glokta is and how his story starts?
Glokta's story starts with a fierce battle against some stairs. We meet him as he laments that he has to go down some steps, because don't you know that if you are horribly crippled and your whole body hurts with every step, going downstairs is actually a lot worse than going up, because if you're going up, you have less of a distance to fall if you trip. So he is heading down into the dungeon, and we are wondering, what is he doing here? Well, it turns out he is actually an inquisitor with an institution called the Inquisition. And at his mercy, we have one of his old friend, Ruth. The audiobook narrator does this fantastic thing where Glokta has no front teeth, so when he speaks there is a lisp, and it's in his internal monologue he does not have a lisp, because he thinks of himself as he used to be before he was horribly crippled by Gurkul. And basically, we have a torture scene that proves that torture doesn't work. We find out that the Inquisition is basically a secret police force. They're the Stasi. They're trying to torture information out of people and make them sign confessions so they can corrupt the system and play the systemic game.
The thing about Glokta is that he has the backstory that he was like a very promising young guy. He won whatever their world championship for swordsmanship is, and he did like some kind of grand charge on the Gurkish during a Gurkish war. Gurkish are just Middle Easterners, and basically they caught him though, and he was tortured to the point where like he has a limp now. He's incontinent at times. All of his teeth were taken out so that none of them match up, so he can only eat gruel at this point. I think those are his injuries. Basically, he was like very broken as a man, and now he's an inquisitor and he tortures people.
Can I do a little bit of a tiny mini spoiler? We do find out that he was a great fencer. He was I think he was a major in the army, and he did a charge where he was captured. But he wasn't actually a war hero. He was known as an infamous asshole who got his entire battalion killed, and then they left him in torture for 7 years in Gurkul.
That's something that I would have liked the context of in this book, but I understand how that would be a very big character moment that should come into play in a later book. But like that actually I think would have helped a little bit with Glokta's character and my problems with it that we'll talk about in a little bit. But I want to talk about torture for a minute, because there is a very common trope that you guys have heard me complain about on this chapter, where a main character usually will have to make a tough decision and they'll torture one of like an enemy, or even a good character or whatever, and that enemy will give them information, and they will give them very accurate information. The problem with this is not necessarily that the character is doing a bad thing. If the character is doing a bad thing, okay, that can be handled in the context of the world.
Well, usually the books treats it as, oh, they had no choice, and the person being tortured is like an NPC character. It's not someone who has shown up in the book. It's not someone who has any kind of agency or character presence. So we are allowed to just kind of not think about what a terrible thing it is. And then they just give them very accurate information. It's like, oh, torture works, yay!
It might as well be like a quick time execution in a game for all that the person generally has backstory. And the thing is that torture in the real world does not work. It's not, to quote Picard, a favorite of me and Lindbergh's, torture has never been a reliable means of intelligence gathering. It just isn't. Like, there was a big discussion about this in America, like 10 years ago. People still think torture works. The problem is that from the tortured... so from the tortured point of view, why would they give you accurate information? Why would they tell you the truth? They would just tell you a lie. They would tell you anything to get you to stop doing the thing you're doing now. And it makes sense from a character perspective, in that, like, this is a way of getting information quickly it's convenient for the author for it to work. But it doesn't, and it plays on a harmful stereotype that people then take into the real world. To use a little bit of an example that's maybe a little bit weird, but I think it holds true. It's a bit like assault or grape in a book, in that, yes, it's a convenient way of not having the character killed and adding a tragic, backstory, usually to a female character, but by putting into the book, you have to understand that you are changing how people think about something in the real world that has a lot of misconceptions and emotional weight attached to it. And so I find that I very much dislike when people do that with torture, because it makes people in the real world think differently about it. And in this book, it's shown pretty much from the beginning that, like, all Glokta wants is for the guy to tell him what he wants and to give him... like, there's literally a point where he's like, okay, put another name on the confession so you can sign it. And, like, it's very clearly from the very beginning. And also the guy he's originally torturing is an old friend of his. And there's a great moment later in the book where he's talking to West, who's another friend of his. And he says, oh, you remember that guy? I wonder what happened to him. He told the funniest jokes. And Glokta, in his point of view, is like, oh, shit. Like, I just tortured that guy. I'm not going to mention that. More than not being portrayed as good, it's not portrayed as effective. And that I liked about its portrayal in the book. And I think this is the right way to do it.
Abercrombie actually has a big thesis about torture that will span throughout this entire series. And it's basically spinning off the idea that even if you do torture someone and you get information, how do you filter that information? How do you know what is what? So what torture actually becomes, is that it becomes a catch-22. you get lots of information, you don't know what's true, so you keep torturing and just try to wring everything out of the person you can. And then when they're dead, you have to try and sort of figure out if anything they said is true. But we do find out that the Inquisition isn't really about finding truth. They don't really care about truth. They're more like a detective agency that investigate, and when they have decided that this benefits us, they send in their torturers to get them to get people to confirm that, oh yeah, this is true. They're going to sign confessions. They're going to make court cases. So it's a system of huge corruption that is basically in place to control people.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the problems I did have, is that it's called the Inquisition, which makes all of us think of the Spanish Inquisition, right? But the thing about the Spanish Inquisition is that it had very specific, it was backed up by a religious institution. It very much affected people who were religious dissidents, you know, maybe Muslim, maybe Jewish, and it had the power of the crown behind it. And so I understand that in this you kind of have to suspend a little disbelief so that Abercrombie can play with the tropes he wants to play with, because it doesn't totally make sense that in this very secular religion where there's a very weak king that you would have the ability to torture like powerful people. And like that's played with in that Abercrombie also wants to talk about the way that like you can't just torture anybody. If you torture a poor person, that's fine, but if you torture a rich person, you need to make sure that you get a confession out of it. And so there was a little bit of a disconnect there. That I think is something that you either have to be okay with him playing a little broadly with the rules of the world, or you're not going to be okay with it. And I kind of straddled the line a little.
He is trying to establish a sort of triad of three great institutions of power, where the king isn't really one of them. One of the institutions of power is the nobility. The other institution of power is the mercers, as he call them. It's the merchant class, which are frowned upon by the nobility because they're new money and you know, they have no blood, but they're rich. So you can't entirely dismiss them because banks are a big factor. Everyone needs money, right? And the third institution of power is the Inquisition. And they sort of balance this power war between the mercers and the nobility. And as you say, you have to kind of suspend your disbelief a little, because how did this come to be? Because the Inquisition, they don't own any capital, they don't really have anything to back up their institutional power. They're just there as a sort of police force, and we don't really know how that works. And I think this is one of the cases where Abercrombie just has a sense of humor. Like, he named them the Inquisition as a kind of joke to say that, oh, they didn't really have any good reasons. They didn't have any legitimacy. And yet they're just out here torturing people as a kind of, the Spanish Inquisition was also bollocks.
I think this is also where the tone of the book is something you need to latch onto or not, and that Abercrombie is a bit... I mean, he's been described as like Tarantino-esque, and I think that's a very accurate way to describe him in certain ways, in that what he's giving you is a world that doesn't internally make complete sense, but is an exaggerated version of it, and you're supposed to take it... I mean, you know... I think you've talked about this before, but you're supposed to take it in a little bit of a British comedy way, where everything is a little exaggerated and a little cartoony, while at the same time being very dark.
It's super British comedy. Have you watched Monty Python? For example, in The Meaning of Life, where when someone signs an organ donor contract, and the organ donor people shows up way before death to harvest their organs. It's like that. It's that tone of comedy. And it's something that you either get or you don't.
Well, I think it's also something that needs... This isn't a full-on comedy, so it does need a little bit of the bones of a traditional fantasy or novel. And I think he doesn't quite balance it here. I think it veers a little too into cartoony than it might in other books, and I think that's one of the places that this is like new bookitis, in that he just didn't have a firm hold on it necessarily, and so that could turn people off. I mean, I haven't said it yet, but I would be very interested to read like The Heroes, which is one of his later books. That's basically just one big battle. That like I'm very curious to see how his craft improves, and also that's military fiction. So
in your military arc, your military fiction arc. You can read
right now we're going through a dark fantasy arc, and then we're going to do a military fiction arc, which will be fun. But yeah, I think that's something where, like, in the Inquisition, it just doesn't... So Ben had a point that I did think it was strange how secular the Union was. So this is a problem with all fantasy, is that all fantasy is way too secular compared to periods in every period in the past. And that just becomes... That's a thing where fantasy authors conceive of the world a little bit too much as it is now because they don't know how else to conceive of it. And also it would be very alienating for characters to be as religious as they would have been back then. And it's also something where I don't think it's necessarily... I think it's something where they want to talk to audiences now, not to audiences then. And so making a character or society non-religious kind of makes sense, you know? Like there's as I said, there's a way that when you're writing a book, you're talking to people now, not back then, and so you need to make it accessible to people now. Yeah, but basically, one thing I will say is that basically the next part of Glokta's storyline is that he basically follows this thread through his investigations and tortures of the Mercers, who are these merchants who are kind of like jumped up. And the idea is that he is trying, his superior wants... There is a vacancy on the High Court, and his superior wants to be the person who gets there. So to do it, they're going to knock out some other people and kind of consolidate power through this investigation of the Mercers. And again, this is a place where it's like, it's very clearly they have an agenda when it comes to this torture. It's not really supposed to be effective per se. And I felt like this storyline went on too long. Because I feel like, okay, the first scene with him torturing somebody, you get a lot about his character. You get kind of who he is. And then he tortures like 3 more people, and each time I kind of got less and less. It's kind of the same scene. I didn't get any new views on his character. And so that's a thing where, like, yeah, this feels a little bit like Abercrombie didn't quite know when the reader was going to get the point and when they weren't, or what he should do till the end of the book.
Which scene to pick that is pivotal, and in transporting the plot from point A to point B, he writes a lot of filler because he feels like, and then this needs to happen, and that would cause this to happen, and he didn't know which of that to just imply and filter out and not show. So we do get too many torture scenes. The first one with Roos is a good character introduction, both because it is one of his old friends he's torturing, and it has some comedy, it has some grimness, like you immediately get the tone of, this is the book, and if that's not your thing, you can bow out quickly. And the next torture scene is of Sepp Dan Teufel, which is kind of trumped up to be significant because Sepp Dan Teufel is the master of the mints. He is nobility. It is not something that is done. And after that, the torture scenes kind of just blend together. And the sum of that whole plot line is that Glokta was sent on a wild goose chase, which is also kind of new author syndrome. It was just a sort of transport mode to get him on the trail of this bank called Valet and Bulk.
Yeah, and I think it's something where, again, there's and this is kind of what I mean when I talk about the characters having a little bit, not quite enough emotionality, is that, like, Glokta... Okay, so I'll just be honest, I did not like Glokta as a character, and not because he's a bad person, but just because he fucking won't stop whining about being tortured and, like, being... And, like, at the beginning I was like, okay, this is all good, but after a while it lacked a level of deepness to his complaining. Like, I would have liked, you know, flashbacks, PTSD. He just keeps talking about it, and this is one of the things about Abercrombie's narration style, is that his characters have very good characterizing thoughts. Like their self-talk is very good. Giselle does this a lot. And so like it works at first, but then he just won't shut up. And I also got the sense, and again, I don't know how much this is borne out by the series and how much of this is affected by knowing a few things that happen and then also having read Best Served Cold, but I got the sense that Abercrombie liked Glocta more than I did, and that kind of gave me a bit of a myopic worldview of the novel of like everybody's shit and like, well, at least Glocta's kind of effective. And that also comes back to a little bit of what we were talking about, the exaggerated nature of it, and that like the nobility in this world are just really terrible, like cartoonishly bad people. And so like it kind of felt a little unfair that like that part of it, like, and because Glocta deals with them so much, kind of like wore on me over time. I would have liked to see more of, if Glocta is going to be this cruel character, where does this come from? And if it is true that, you know, he was a terrible person before the, you know, his epic charge or whatever, then, like, I kind of would have liked to know that he was a terrible person all along. There's a part at the end where Glocta is like, why do I do this? I don't know. And I was like, that's a good question. I also would like to have you grapple with that a little bit more in this novel.
You're actually right, knowing that today's Glocta is arguably a better version of Glocta, which seems impossible considering that he is a whiny, incredibly self-centered, narcissistic character who hates everything to an almost exaggerated degree. And first of all, I think that is your kind of Achilles heel. You don't like whiny characters. He is your Gen. He is Gen for you. That was me during I was like, shut the fuck up, Gen. Do something.
Yeah, it reminded me a little bit of that.
Yeah, Glocta kind of gives me that, but at least he does something. So I understand the conceit there. But I do think that you are onto something with that. The characters do have these pivotal sort of character thoughts and conceits they struggle with. But sometimes the new authorishness comes through in that something's become a little bit static. We repeat the same kind of things a few too many times. Like, we got it the first, second, and third time. We could just kind of speed it up and get on with it and waste less time. So the plot could start quite a lot earlier. All that said, Glocta is the fan favorite character. It is so funny that you hate him. It's like most people they don't care for anything except Glocta because he's such an unusual character.
I get it. I mean, he's also, you know, he's the House MD like archetype, and so like I get it. But to me, it's just like, again, I would have liked to see the depths of his actual trauma instead of complaining about it a lot. So like, and it's something where, again, so towards the end, so there's a character called Colum West, who's like, he's the, you know, unnoble guy who rose in the military, and he's like a very good guy. You know, he has a moment later we'll talk about where he's not so good. But for the most part, he's a very good guy. And unfortunately, he has this thing where he likes characters who aren't good people. For some reason, that's just a character type of him. He likes Glocta and he likes Giselle, and I can never quite figure out why. But I really would have liked some of that reveal of Glocta's character beforehand through West. Being like, you know, I never really liked you that much. You were never like that good a person anyway. They have a conversation at the end of the book.
Or they could at least think about why they were friends despite Glocta being such an ass.
Yeah, and I feel like that would have helped with Glocta's character of realizing like, oh, you know, he was kind of always shitty. So like him being tortured is not necessarily an excuse for him to be more shitty now. And like, I think, and so Colum West has a part where he talks to Glocta. At the end of the book, they have a conversation where Glocta has felt betrayed because he felt like West never saw him after he got tortured, and West tells him, no, I did. I went to go see you, but your mother turned me away because I was poor. I went twice. And, like, that is a moment where Glocta is like, oh, shit. And I really, really liked this scene. It's a very humanizing moment for Glocta. It's a part where it didn't feel like he was a bit of a self-insert. It was like, oh, he was on the back foot a little bit. It forces him to open up in a different way. And I would have liked that halfway through the book. I feel like that would have been such an interesting thing. And then there could have been more with his relationship with West.
It's also a moment that crystallizes that a lot of Glocta's antipathy towards other people comes from his kind of persecution complex, where he knows that he wasn't a very good person. And before, when he was successful and beautiful and good at fencing and everything, people just had to put up with him. But now that he's a crippled, horrid mess, he is kind of shunned by all of society, and his coping mechanism is kind of hating everyone and everything. And that doesn't really... you don't really feel it or understand it as much until he has this moment with West that he has pretty much thought of as a traitor in the whole book. And then he realizes that, oh, you did try to see me. It was your family that turned, as it was my family that turned you away. And that kind of just gives you context to why Glokta, it gives you nuance, it gives you dimension to why Glokta is this way. And it's one of those things that humanizes him and lets you empathize just a little bit more.
Yeah, and it challenges him. And that's the thing, is it could have led to a certain amount of change, and otherwise, like, Glokta doesn't super change in this book, and that could have been really a moment. And it also, again, is another moment like the one with Forley, of like, oh, this is not a myopic world. People in it, it is a dark world, but there are moments of like, people are actually kind sometimes, you know, and that would have been a way to kind of challenge Glokta on that. And so again, I would have liked that moved way forward. I would have liked that if that was earlier. And also because now he's not going to interact with West, I'm assuming for most of the rest of the trilogy, where I think that would have been actually kind of an interesting interaction of him in his current state trying to be friends with West, and also maybe realizing like, oh, maybe part of the reason nobody likes me anymore is because this is a vapid society, and I would not have liked me. I would have been shitty to myself, and I kind of need to deal and process with that. And again, I don't necessarily know how much of that is in later books, but I would have liked more of that in this one.
It's also very first booky in that when we are in West's perspective, he doesn't think about Glokta either. Even though they meet early on, and West becomes aware that, you know, his old friend is still alive and he is in town. So it's kind of like they should have been interwoven a lot more, because they are the only significant other kind of to each other. Like, West has his sister, but Glokta doesn't really have anyone except his practicals, and they are just rather newer work acquaintances. So they should have had a lot more character interactions. We should have seen their reunion earlier, and together we could also have gotten another dimension to the Adi problem. Except now we just get a throwaway, or sort of like, oh, when I go to war, can you take care of my sister? She's a hot fucking mess.
We'll actually get to her in a minute, because the other person, the other main character is Giselle. Giselle is a vapid fop of a character. He's very rich. His father favors him.
Before we go on, Ben's comment.
I would say that
I didn't fully grasp the Glokta hype until book 2. I wholly agree with this. Like, as I have said to Will before, it is a terrible shame that people have to come into the series at book 1. I really do feel like it is very clumsy in a lot of its character exposition, because we get a lot of exposition that doesn't build anything, and a lot of the understanding you have of Logan and Glokta comes in book 2. Sorry. Because there we see Glokta being seriously challenged by the plot.
Yeah, I would be very curious to actually read book 2. So we'll see if that ever actually like happens. Oof. The thing is, it's a double down. It would be like either I'll like it or I'll really dislike it after having, you know, made it through. So it's like, it's a bit of a, I don't know if it's worth it. Right. So the next thing that happened, right, Giselle. And Giselle is my favorite character, because I have this thing where like, I don't like bitchy boys who are supposed to be hot, but I like really extra boys who the author knows are very extra. Like, I just find it hilarious how extra he is about things. Abercrombie's kind of exaggerated style also works really great with him. There's a part where so their king is like a drooling idiot. I don't know what the nowadays term would be for it. And there's a part
senile.
Yeah, I thought I got the impression he had been like that for a very long time though. But you're right, maybe
Yeah,
he's
I
just
think he's
senile.
very old.
Yeah, and there's a part where like he mistakes Giselle for his son in front of a bunch of people and like hugs him, and like Giselle and everybody's like looking on horrified. And there's a great line where like, and the chapter ends on it where Giselle's like, "You couldn't imagine everyone looking at this." His greatest embarrassment, like his Giselle's greatest embarrassment. And it's such a funny line because it's not what you expect. Giselle is always consistently worse thing of a person than you expect. But by virtue of that, I found him very funny. And I think this is also, and again, this is more where Abercrombie's, surface level thought process and self-talk really work well. And the other thing that works about Giselle is that he does have what I felt like was more of an underlying emotional life in that he kind of starts falling in love with Colm's West sister, Artie. But like in a way where like this is challenging him as a person because he doesn't know what to do. She's poor, she's dark, she like curses a lot. He also in his internal thoughts is like very much misogynistic about women and their sexuality, but like in a way that's period appropriate. And I actually think that is an underrated thing in that it makes a lot of the rest of his behavior more believable of like, oh no, he is kind of a product of that time in society, and so we're grading on a curve a little bit here. And again, I really liked him as a character. I thought he was really funny. I kind of got the sense that I don't think Abercrombie likes him as much as I do, but like, you know.
I actually do think Joe really likes Giselle because he shows up in later books, and as Giselle is a messy bitch. Okay, he's a messy bitch, but
It's so funny.
But underlying all of his foppishness and, you know, his vanity, there is a little grain of him that knows that he is, you know, a bag of hot air. Like he is kind of constantly fighting against that realization, you know, that, oh, I'm a bit of a nothing, aren't I? I'm pretty and that's it. And that really helps you feel like, oh, it's relatable because you also have these fears. Like, what if you're a miserable, what if you're a failure? What if everyone is embarrassed of you? And why can't you do anything right?
There's a part where he's like, and then he had a deep, unsettling thought, which was, if not for his chin and his something else and something else, what would Artie like about him? It's just great. Like, obviously he knows he's these things.
Yeah. And there's another point as well where he's like, why Artie? Why out of all the, like, she is magnificent, but she isn't that special. But she didn't like him. And maybe that's why he liked her so much, because she saw what a nothing he was. And he wanted nothing more than to make her like him. And that is just a pivotal character moment where you're like, oh. He shows a little bit of insight, a little bit of growth. And it's sympathetic.
Yeah, and it's very relatable. Like he's very cool in front of everybody else, and then he like stutters in front of her, and he's like, "I love you" at the end, and he's like, he never really said that to anybody, and it was dumb and not how he wanted to say it, but it, you know, he had to, and like, yeah, I think you're right. I do think Joe Abercrombie does like him maybe more than I initially had assumed.
Abercrombie would never have written him with this much empathy if he didn't like him. I actually think he likes all of his point of view characters because he puts so much effort into trying to make them human, even if they aren't good people. But I do think that, like me, he has a love of fops, because the other foppish character, Prince Ladislas, is also, he's like a caricature. He's so vapid, so stupid, but there is an underlying hint of, you know, it's kind of charming.
Yeah, and I think this is where the comedic stylings of the book shine the best, is with these characters who are a little bit more overtly comedic, because like Giselle's whole plot line for the first half of the book is that he wants to win the big sword tournament, but he also doesn't want to train. because it's a lot of work. And he's also like
It's
not
so
sure.
hard.
Yeah, at one point, his training master has Glock to talk to him and be like, and Glock is like, you know, the reason you do this is for the acclaim and for everyone to look at you great. Like, let's not get this mixed up. And it's supposed to be like a motivating moment. And you know, Giselle sits there and thinks for a minute, and then he goes and decides he's going to quit because he doesn't want to do all the work and he doesn't care about other people. And it was so relatable. I was just like, this is so funny. Because, yeah, he always does the thing you're not expecting. And then he talks to Artie, and he's like, okay, I'm going to win because she doesn't want me to. And I got slightly
and he's
offended.
like, I'm going to prove to her that I can. He's sort of low-key doing it for her because he wants to be something for her, and it's just really relatable, all of it.
And so Artie is another character who's not a viewpoint character, but she's in Glocta's point of view a little bit, she's in Giselle's a bit, and she's in West's a bit. And she's kind of interesting because at first she kind of seems like a little bit of like the not like other girls trope, but then you realize she's also like a messy
like the
drunk.
sex pot, not like other girls.
Like, I rolled my eyes when, like, Giselle immediately couldn't think of words to form for her, and, like, oh, she's actually funny, not like those other girls. But, like, there's more to her in terms of, you know, she's also, like, a messy and alcoholic, and we get to figure out a little bit more about her.
And she's kind of mean.
Yeah, she is. She actually is. Like, you don't see it a lot from...
She's mean to her brother, she's mean to Giselle, and she's also smart and quippy, so she can kind of play it off where you're not entirely sure how mean she is, but you kind of sense that she is rather mean.
Yeah, it's true. And that's something I think about the female presence in this book, is that there's not a lot of female characters, but you also get a sense that Abercrombie isn't anti-woman in the way you kind of get that from some older fantasy, where it's like they either don't care about women or they're just like, well, they're over there and pretty. Like, there is an extent to which you could very much...
maker or just absent.
yeah, one half of the breeding pair, or just not really around. And so, like, there aren't a lot of women in the book, but it doesn't, I think, to me at least, feel like he's being hostile to women. Yeah, they're just, like, I think, honestly, this is a bit of a Brandon Sanderson, where he was just like, oh shit, I made my 3 main characters and then I realized there weren't any other women. Like, you know, it's like, it's almost a bit of that, where the new book Itis, where you just didn't quite realize, like, oh, maybe you needed to early on plan for them to be women. Because what I understand from his later sequel trilogy to this, there are like women point of views and stuff.
Oh, the best character is a woman, but there's a lot of female characters that are very important for the story. So I think it's just that he imagined a plot, he imagined a setting, and most of the characters were men. Because in the Union, women aren't soldiers. So, and most of the characters are somewhat involved in the military in some way. So we don't get them. But the ones we do get, they're good.
And it's another thing where it's like, I would be interested to see where he goes with, like, Artie's character and some other women. Because there is another character who appears halfway through the book, and this is another example of a plot line that I'm not really sure why it exists. Her name is Pharaoh. She's from the Middle East country, and her whole thing is revenge. And you can tell because she literally has no other thoughts about anything else other than revenge against the slavers. And, like, she's kind of funny once she starts interacting with the main cast, because this one-note character very much bounces around other people in a funny way. But, like, we get, like, 5 chapters of her just, like, going northward and fighting
traveling with Yulway.
Yeah, again, it's another thing where it's like, this is good character building or character exploration for yourself as a writer, but we didn't actually need it.
No, we could have condensed the entire thing. Where they kind of meet and they have an altercation with the Eaters, because it's kind of an introduction to the Eaters more in the flesh. We do get the scene with Logan in the tower and the Eater, but this is the first time we actually see the Eaters, and we get a first sort of crumb of what the Eaters are. But then we could just move them to Adjua, because, as you say, it is when she interacts with the rest of the cast that she gets more character development, and it's also fun to see the other characters through her eyes, because she has a very unique voice and a very unique perspective. Like, she has a very different set of priorities for life and what is useful in other people than all the other characters together. So we should just speed her up and put her there, but also Joe kind of forgets to tell us why she matters. I know why she matters, but it's like he is too focused, like a lot of new authors who think they're clever. They have this grand scheme built up in their heads, and they are they hold their cards a bit too close to the heart. They're like, I'm not going to reveal it yet. You're going to find out later. And it ends up just feeling a little bit pointless, and you don't really know why these things are happening. And Pharaoh is yet another example. Yulway as well. Why is he even here? Why does this matter?
Yeah, who's this mage? What's going on? And that's where the name of the series comes from, the First Law trilogy, which is that wizards in this world, the first law is don't reach into the demon side of creation, the other side, and the second law
Don't touch the world below from which all magic stems. And the second law is, thou shalt not eat the flesh of man.
But if you do, you become really cool and powerful. And that's where, like, the bad wizards are from, the bad in quotation marks.
Jumping back to religion and how the Union, how the Union is surprisingly secular. I think it's supposed to, this is just a theory, but I think it's supposed to stem from the fact that the maker and his siblings, they were the descendants of God, Eos, and they were also gods, and then they were killed, and now we come into the story at least 1,000 years later. So basically the gods are dead, they're gone. And that's sort of supposed to be sort of a play on why everyone is so secularized. They have no one to pray to. Which is also kind of naivistic, because wouldn't they have invented a new god at this point?
Well, I mean, there's no god in our world, and we definitely came up with a bunch of them. The thing about the magics and lore and ancient stuff is I liked it at first. It was interesting when it was kind of mystical with Baez, and you were like really not sure what was going on. And then towards the middle part, it gets kind of like a little bit lore heavy in a way that I don't feel like Abercrombie is super interested in. Like, I was actually surprised by how much magic is in this book, because I kind of assumed there wasn't going to be any, or like just a very limited amount. I don't think it's really where Abercrombie's interest lies. That being said, it wasn't like super annoying. It was just a little bit grating at times. And that's kind of the second, like, we have all the characters and how they started and how they've gotten to Adjor, right? And then what basically happens is that Bethod, declares war on the Union. There's actually a very kind of creepy scene where he sends like a half demon creature into their whatever their assembly is called, and I was like, oh wow, like this is more creepy and atmospheric than I thought the book was going to, and I would have liked kind of more of that throughout the book, of reaching in to like that kind of dichotomy, but unfortunately this is really like the only moment.
He sends in Fenris the Feared, which is like a huge pale
hulking
milky
creature,
white dude with like blue runes all over its body that has this deep booming voice, and it just seems weird and inhuman, and everyone's afraid of it.
Yeah, I really like that.
It's really gutting me, because he is trying to sort of tease that old magics are kind of awakening in the north, and then the book ends before we actually get to the north, and it kind of guts me, because that's when it really gets good, and I can say that until I'm blue in the face, but if it's not in this book, it's just not in the book.
Yeah, I saw in the Book Talk channel, by the way, we have a Book Talk channel on Discord that's exclusive to the book club members. Come join, it's a good time. You had mentioned that the trilogy almost would work better as a duology, and I actually think that's true, just from the fact that this book's plot stops right before it gets good, and sort of like an arch without a keystone, and the whole thing collapses. But if we go, I don't know, 5 hours into the next book, all of a sudden we have, I'm sure, what is going to be a big battle. We have some of the other plot lines completing a little bit, and so there's like that keystone there to make the whole thing feel a little bit more.
If we condense these 3 books into 2 books, we did a whole lot of cutting in the first period, and we in the first book, and we prioritized the scenes that actually build character, that actually gets things moving, and the character can interact with the plot to give us tidbits as to who they are and why they're here. Then we could structure this more like The Lord of the Rings, for example, where the first book is kind of a travel montage, but there are key things that happen because they do get to Moria. They go through Casa Doom. They get split up because the ring corrupts the brains of men. Saruman does have time to betray the wizards and the world of men. We could have that if we put these two books together. We could have the first battle in the north. We could have our heroes setting out on their journey and starting to meet the world beyond and the kind of challenges that it's going to offer them. And it could be more of a carrot to make you want to keep reading instead of just ending the book right before it starts. Like right before the plot events start.
I actually think The Fellowship of the Ring is a good example of this, because in the movies they actually do move over a little stuff from the second book to the first book. In that Boromir's death scene is something they find after the fact in the beginning of Two Towers, whereas in the movie they moved it to the end of The Fellowship, and like that's such a better moment. Like that really completes Boromir's storyline. It moves Aragorn into wanting to, or not wanting to be king, but knowing more about, accepting more of his Gondorian identity, and even some of the Saruman stuff by getting a viewpoint of Saruman in I was gonna say Saragong, Isengard. You get like a little bit more of what's going to happen with him in the second book. And so like, yeah, I think that's something where it's, it provides a little bit more structure.
And it sets up threads that you could grip onto to want to keep seeing what's going to happen with the story as well.
So in the middle part of the book, Baez gets to the city with Logan, and there's a really funny scene where they go to a costumer for like plays and stuff, and he's like, we're doing a play. Find me something that like would be great for a wizard. And the guy comes out with this great big coat with arcane symbols on it that are just scribbles. And he's like, all right, and then we need a barbarian prince thing for Logan. And it's just like, that was something where I was like, okay, that is poking fun at fantasy in a funny way. And that the appearance of it is really what's important more than necessarily who you are. Like you need to look the part. And I thought that was clever. And basically Baez goes to Congress and is like, I'm the guy who founded the Union. I'm Baez, and nobody really believes him. And Glokta is given the job of like, what's up with this guy? That's weird. And then Giselle has like won the tournament by this point. No, he doesn't. He almost wins it, and then he's going to lose against the last guy, and then Baez helps him out, but without anyone knowing. And of course, Giselle is like, oh, I am great when it comes down to it. Like, he completely doesn't question that I have a second win.
His body filled with an energy. He was fast, he was strong, he was graceful, he could do anything. He was on top of the world. And then Baez takes a little break, and he was like, everything hurt. He couldn't stand up anymore. He couldn't even lift his arm. The blade felt like a weight in his hand. But in the end, he's like, yeah, I totally won from my own strength. That makes sense. I'm awesome.
Another thing is in the city, Logan is very like, oh my god, it's such a big city and so busy and I hate it. And I liked that. I thought that was like a good moment of like, oh, yeah, he's from a small...
That is
like...
so funny and relatable to me. Like, I'm a country girl. And Logan showing up at the cities like, you say, how many people lived here? Thousands and thousands. And why are the houses so tall? And the streets, it's like a war, like you're being jostled everywhere. There is no mercy to be found anywhere. And there's throwaway comments like he horrified passers-by by smiling at them. He sort of, because he's terribly scarred, like his entire face is so scarred, his nose has been broken, he looks kind of like someone has taken a meat hammer to him, and he has healed up very badly, and he just terrifies passers-by by trying to be friendly. And it's really funny, and it's also really relatable. Like if you come into a city and you're like, Jesus, where am I? Where am I going? Everything is too big. There's too many people. There's too much noise. Everyone is kind of pushing into you because everyone knows where they're going. And you just feel like a bull in a china shop. That is so relatable to me personally. And it really endears Logan to me.
I know New York is supposed to be the greatest city in the world, but when I went there, I mostly just think of it as a city for roaches because it's so dirty. There's like sound everywhere. There's streets everywhere. There's smog everywhere, and like I just didn't like it, like just sensation wise. And so yeah, I was like, I'm with you, Logan. This is weird. That doesn't really go anywhere. I would have liked to see that go somewhere more in terms of like, oh, maybe he's now thinking about like, oh, method. This like this. Bethod, this is not even a joke. I just keep forgetting. Bethod, like, oh man, he doesn't know what he's throwing himself at, or something like that. I would have or like, oh, I kind of see maybe what Bethod thinks he's doing now, but he needs to understand that like this is not the North and this is not what the North should be. Something I think a little
when
bit
they
more
first
like
arrive, he makes one comment that says, Bethod is gonna make war on that.
And
it's kind of his gut reaction. And later on, he also watches the military drills, and he's kind of horrified that all the military personnel are gaudy young boys, and also that they're dressed in shiny armor, they're in big, nice squares, and they do martial turnabouts and marching. And he's like, that works when you're on a flat plain all together, but how will it work in the woods?
Okay, so here's the thing.
And Will is going to complain.
Because I understand what Abercrombie is going for something when he talks about weapons and armor, and I understand what he's going for, but the problem is that it's one of these mismatches between the world building being solid and then his exaggeration of it. So for example, like the last guy that Giselle fights in the tournament is like using a better, like a less of a fencing kind of sword and more of like what you get a sense for like a long sword, and it's more about strength. And, you know, and he's beating everyone around him, and he's even beating Giselle, and then Glocta's like, oh, you know, in a few years everyone will be fighting like that. And the thing is that actually doesn't really make a lot of sense, because fencing is a later art form from long swords, and it has to do more with the fact that like it like one developed from the other, and like on the battlefield they might be better, but in
our world, fencing, well, actually rapiers developed from the fact that armor became more and more, they covered larger and larger portions of the body. There were fewer and fewer gaps where you could get in a sword, so the swords became thinner and thinner to kind of be able to poke at you in the few exposed points of flesh. And another thing that became popular was also blunt weapons, like you could blunt force people and sort of crush them because you couldn't actually stick them anymore. So yeah, it doesn't actually make sense, but you're just gonna have to go with it. Like Abercrombie himself has said that he writes like a 16th century society, but they have some 18th century technology, and also their military structure of the Union is more like 19th century Prussia sort of ish, because they have the modern military ranks. And he's like, but it's just good fun, huh, dude?
Yeah, I mean, I get it, but it's one of these things where it's like, yeah, I get that if you don't know about military stuff much, you might be like, oh, pikemen aren't good for this or that, but like...
And it's not historical fantasy. It doesn't pretend to be historical fantasy.
I know, it bothered me. You mentioned one point, do you want to explain about the fencing steels and like why you named them that?
If you noticed, like the barbarians, they will talk about war axes. They will talk about, at one point, Logan gains a sword that was forged by Canadius, the master maker. But when they're fencing, they just call them steels. And that is Abercrombie having like a little funny joke at, you know, oh, in fantasy, like no one cares about the weapons. No one cares about what they do, what they were made for. So he just named them steels as a kind of throwaway, like... In the same manner that a lot of authors get lazy and call their currency coin. So he's like, I got just fencing steels.
Here, again, it also feels like a little bit of a professional thing. So here I thought it was funny versus coins, which I hate with everything in my body. And so, yeah, and so that's a part with Logan. Then Baya's like goes into this tower that's been closed forever and ever. And I thought this was kind of a cool scene because, I do like that whole magic coming back into the world feel. They somehow get above the city without ever actually having walked any stairs, and Glokta's like, what the fuck?
First, Bias infiltrates the High Council meeting, and they are convinced he's a fraud. So Glokta gets put on the mission to expose Bias as a fraud. And Bias says, fine, I'll prove I am who I am. I have the key to this tower. And he holds up a metal cylinder, and everyone's like, that's not a key, dude. You're a fake. And he's like, but no, just bring your representative of the Inquisition, bring your greatest swordsman as a witness, and we'll go into the tower. So then they head off to this Tower of the Maker, as it's called. And the Tower of the Maker is older than Agio itself. Agio kind of grew around the tower. Sort of like, people settling around their idol of a church, to worship their god. Blink, blink, blink. But so basically they go there. And at first, Bias is horrified because the order that's supposed to guard the door is just one dude sitting on a chair, and he's like, yeah, my wife's off. She's making breakfast. We're having eggs. And Bias is like, this is an insult, and it's so dirty. And they head up to the door, and at that point, there is a magic aura in the place, so everyone starts feeling really nauseous and sick, and it's the first kind of hint you get at magic having a very physical presence in the story, because up until then, magic has kind of been something like everyone's like, that doesn't exist anymore. Sort of like it is in A Song of Ice and Fire.
I really like that they started getting like kind of nauseous and weird, because I always like magic as some kind of a weird antithetical to our reality kind of force, and so like I really liked it. And I also thought it was like a nice way of being subtle about it. I actually would have liked, because the thing is, by this point we've seen Baez break open a tower wall and also set like a whole small stand of trees on fire with like a breath. And I kind of would have liked it if
made the Archlector's chair disappear with a bang from under his ass.
Yeah, and so like I would have liked if maybe we had held off on those moments and kept to these moments a little bit more. But I think that's kind of a personal taste thing. I just like very low magic settings, a la, A Song of Ice and Fire.
I do too. Like, it's the threat of magic almost feels more palpable than actually seeing magic on page.
Yeah, or even the characters not necessarily knowing what is or isn't. So like that scene with Fenris, as Ben said, I like the Fenris the Feared scene because this is a low magic universe, so seeing this Warhammer monstrous creature in the middle of Congress is actually scary and jarring. Which is like, and that was the thing, is like, we weren't in Fenris's head, so it was just like, what the, like, this is very weird. So basically they go into the tower, they get like a sword, I think, and something else. This is the part where like the plot started becoming very treacly for me.
They get a staff, but also they get a box containing something called the seed.
Yes, which Baez is like, don't touch that thing. It's real bad for you.
He's like, don't touch anything.
And then outside of the action scene at the end of the book, I don't remember what happens after this. Does anything? I mean, there's the scene with Artie and West, which we'll talk about. But
no, we basically have West running around because he has become a commissioned officer with the leader of the army, the Supreme Commander. Burr has made him part of his staff, and part of West's character arc is that he is a commoner who has made it to the rank of major in the army, and just as it was in the olden days in Prussia, like the army consisted of noblemen. Like being a nobleman ensured you a commissioned position in the army. It was a game for the rich and the noble and the powerful of good blood. And as a commoner, West is seen as a kind of insult to the army as a whole. So as a part of Marshal Burr's staff, we just see him sort of running around and trying to exert his new power, and the nobility trying to dismiss him as a nothing. And he also runs into Yulway and Pharaoh as they enter the city. And since Pharaoh she hates pink, she distrusts everyone. So upon entering the city, she like pulls a knife and is going to start knifing everyone because she wants to knife everyone. And he has to kind of talk her down. And they have this kind of interesting little moment where he looks at her and gives a very unflattering description of who she is. She's like, her hair cropped short, she was dirty, she stank, her eyes were yellow like piss. And then anyway, he shows her empathy and talks her down and gets her to surrender her knife so they can enter the city. And later on, we see that Pharaoh remembers that same interaction. He was like, I was going to stick him. But then he looked at me like I was human, so I decided not to.
I did like that moment. I thought, again, Colin West is like the one good character. And he's interesting because he, in another book, would be the main character, is the feeling you get. But, like, I don't think, I originally thought that he was going to be, like, killed off really early. And, like, it was going to be a subversion of the trope. But I think it works better that he is the good character who would be a main character, but actually this book is focusing on other characters. But
that's why you asked me when he dies. I thought that was just your way of saying you hated the character.
No, I just assumed he was going to die early as, like, oh, there are no heroes in this world type of a moment. But, no, but he's just not focused on, which I think is a better balance. And I liked him having to run around because, you know, there's that saying that amateurs talk strategy while professionals talk logistics. And so he's like, now I understand why we never had enough food in Gurland. Wherever.
And carts and horses and provisions and ammunition, like, no, not ammunition, but something else. Like he really thinks about the logistics and how these institutions of power and how these institutions that are built on pride and, you know, each individual's sense of pride kind of keeps the machinery from working as it's intended to work. And that is really interesting commentary, I thought.
I would have liked to see more of it, but I understand that, like, following a logistics train is maybe not the most interesting thing.
Yeah, we get more of that in the next book.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Martin makes it kind of work in one chapter in Clash of Kings, where Tyrion's running around trying to figure out how to get the siege to work or whatever, but he also mixes it with some politicking meanwhile. And so, like, I understand why maybe Abercrombie didn't go for it.
Chris M's comment, just quickly returning to what they were in the tower for. Did they get the seed? I had the impression that they were going to find the seed and the box was supposed to hold it. You're correct, Chris. That is exactly what happened. It's actually a testament to how aimless the scene kind of feels, because I ought to remember that after all the times I've read this book, but I didn't. You're right. They did get the box that is supposed to hold the seed, but we don't really understand why the box is special, or how it is pivotal. The setting is more impressive than what they actually do in the place.
And the going into the tower itself is kind of the interesting part of it, not so much what they got from it. But now that they had it, Baez is like, okay, we're gonna go on a quest to the Roman place. And Logan, you're coming. Pharaoh, you're coming. And also, Giselle, you're coming. And Giselle's like, but I want to go to war. There's not gonna be a chance to earn glory. Which I thought was very funny. And then before that happens, though, some of the Inquisition who's not under Glocta is going to fight, or was going to try to get Baez and bring him in. So there's like a very action-y
Pharaoh.
scene.
They want Pharaoh.
Oh, yeah, you're right. And so basically Pharaoh and Logan have to do an action scene and run around and fight. And it looks like they're about to lose, but then Logan is like, oh, he drew deep in himself, and out came the 9 fingers, which is basically like a berserker rage.
The Bloody Nine.
The Bloody Nine, that's what it is. And it's a berserker rage, and he just breaks somebody's face with his own face, and like it's a very cool scene.
It's the name he has been running from. Like little tidbits through the story, we get mentions of the Bloody Nine. People remember him as this big brute barbarian, this savage killer who put entire villages to death, and you know he's infamous throughout the North. And at points we see Logan being like, no, I'm not the Bloody Nine, and thinking that, oh, the moment they realize I'm the Bloody Nine, everyone's going to hate me and fear me and they're going to run away. And now is the time we're supposed to feel like that plot point sort of explodes. Yeah, Column is like, oh, there was this nursery rhyme when I was little that sort of told kids to be careful of because there was this monster in the north called the Bloody Nine. It wasn't you, was it? And Logan's like,
what nice weather we're having. Yeah, it's a funny scene. And basically, and this scene speaks to kind of two problems. One is that Abercrombie is good at writing action. It doesn't feel perfunctory in the way that like Mistborn did, where like fight scenes are just one action after another. There's a good flow to them. There's a good kinetic energy, but they don't really mean a lot. There's very little character moments in them, and like this is like, you know, as much as we said as Logan has been like trying to live a peaceful life, this is not the first time he's gotten into a fight. So it doesn't feel like, oh, this is the moment where suddenly he can no longer deny that part of himself. Or it's not even, it doesn't even necessarily feel like he realized in that moment that he was selfish. He would prefer to unleash this thing than die. It's not really a moment of character growth. It's kind of just a thing that happens. And part of it is that we don't see any aftermath from it. He just is like, we just don't get his point of view again. He's just like tired out or whatever. And so the aftermath of it, I think, would be more interesting in a lot of ways.
You're entirely right. And it also feels a bit like this action scene simply happens because Joe's like, oh, we have to reveal the big mystery of the Bloody Nine in this book. So it kind of got squeezed in, and it's such a, what motivates this attack is that Byers humiliated the Inquisition at the High Council meeting, and as sort of revenge, the Inquisitor, who is extremely paranoid, he's like, we have to get this woman that Byers wants. We have to figure out if she's a spy, what she's about. We have to get her. So that's why they're after Ferro, and Logan just happens to be with Ferro at the moment.
Yeah,
so it's not a very purposeful scene in that sense.
It's not really the villains at work. It's not really like, I even would have, you know, I know Fenris has like his own thing that happens later in the series and whatnot, but like, I think they would have been better if he'd been the mini boss at the end of the book, because at least it would have been like more of a northern connection and more of a connection to like one of the main villains, which is Bethod. I remembered it this time. And the other problem is there's a lot of
bit like he thought, we need a fight scene here. Who can they fight against? It can't be Fenris because we have to save that. And can it be the Eaters? No, we have to keep the Eaters on the down low. They can't be too visible in society at this point. So who's left?
Exactly. And that's something where I was like, yeah, that's one of the reasons it's putting too much weight. Like the weight, you know, going back to the arch analogy, all this weight from the book is being put on this point that isn't really designed to handle it. And so it just kind of feels a bit like, okay, well, that happened and then the book ended. And like, again, I just, I would have liked to see more from what it means from a character perspective. And again, going back to having read Best Served Cold, I don't remember that book very well, but I do remember that some of the action scenes are like that, where like they have a very powerful character moment in it. And so, new bookitis.
Yeah, in later editions, Joe has become rather prolific at writing very good battle scenes, very good war scenes, and also being good at how he uses them to drive plot and to build character. But here it's just a misfire. And as you said, getting the aftermath of Logan reacting to what is supposed to be a regression for him, just cutting that sort of dampens the whole experience. I feel like Logan's arc of being someone who is running away from his past and from himself only to lapse back, it's all a bit wishy-washy, simply because he does not have a strong motivation for coming with Byers. He doesn't have the strongest motivation of why he decides to go on the quest with Byers, other than that he's running away from Bethod.
A lot of the characters kind of just get shuffled from one place to another. Glokta is probably the most active, but even then his overall plot line is decided by his superior telling him to do stuff. And so I think that's another new bookitis where it's like, how do I get the characters to do things? Well, the wizard is like the one who could like moves the party forward, you know, D&D style. Like my characters are along for the ride. The player characters, I haven't played D&D, are along for the ride, but the wizard's the one who decides where we're going.
How do we get that to work? Well, we do less of it, Joe. We do less. Pick your scenes, make it shorter, and just speed it along.
There is one other scene I wanted to talk about because I thought it was both interesting but didn't quite work, which is that Colum West, who again has been just a very good guy, he has like a moment, he has a chapter where he's having a very bad, no good day, and he's very frustrated, and he goes and his sister's like talking back to him, and so in a moment of rage, he starts to throttle her.
We see him throughout the day, and we see how every little negative interaction builds the pressure in him. He's like a pressure cooker, and he pushes it down and goes on with his day. And then he meets antagonism, and he pushes it down, and he goes on with his day. And little by little, with every interaction we see, he blows up a little bit more, because this whole book has kind of been teasing that, you know, oh, he has hell of a temper, but we haven't seen it really until now. And the last altercation he has before coming home is with this nobleman, this quartermaster, that West is trying to get him to stoke his fires and make armaments for the nobles' levies, because the nobles, out of spite, have sent the levies kind of, you know, they're starved, they're limp, they barely have clothes, they have no armor. So West is tasked with getting them equipped for war. It's serious. It's a battle against the North. And this commissioned officer just blows him off. He calls him a dirty commoner who shouldn't be even in the army at all. And West just kind of flips his lid a little bit with the officer, but he still comes out of the interaction feeling kind of humiliated and angry, and he's like, oh, I just made it worse for myself in the future. And then he goes home, and before entering his house, he hears the clinking of glass, and he hears that someone's inside. He's like, Artie, oh, what the fuck, why did I give her a key? Oh, and he's like, he's gonna knock on his own door, and he feels humiliated. And then he's like, and then he had a vivid picture of Artie and Giselle naked, sweaty on the carpet. Because all this book, he has really been worried, because he knows Giselle is such a philanderer, and he's really worried about Artie's virtue. Like, this is kind of a sexist society. He worries about how it will reflect on him if she gets known as a hussy. So he kind of barges in to his own house, and he starts yelling and having this altercation with Artie, who is very flippant and very resentful. And go on, Will.
And so, yeah, and she's like, because again, well, as we've talked about, she is, and not to victim blame or anything, but she is kind of like cruel a little, or not cruel, but just she antagonizes on purpose a little bit. And so she's antagonizing him, and then he kind of explodes, and then afterwards she's like hurt by it, and he's like, oh my god, I'm so sorry. And she's like, you know, he always said he was sorry too. And they're talking about their father, who was abusive, and who Colin kind of left her behind to escape from. And she's like, you know, I never blamed you for that, but like, don't pretend that this isn't what it is. And like, there are elements of this I like. I like that Colin West is otherwise a really good person, because it kind of normalizes abuse as like a thing that even people who are not just evil monsters all the time do. And I think that's an important thing for people to realize. And I do find it interesting in terms of the cyclical kind of abuse, and that their father did it, so that's going to always be lurking somewhat in both of them. And then you're like, oh, that's kind of why she drinks. Maybe but she drinks both to get past it, and also because that's what her father did. So it was a learned mechanism. I felt, though, that like it was a little bit too much of a shock moment, and that it felt like it came out of nowhere. It did not feel like something that we were kind of led to believe Colum had in him, or even like, you know, he had thought about in his point of view that his father was abusive in that way. It literally just feels like he is out of his body for a minute, and his body does a thing, and then he comes back. and is like, oh shit, oops. It actually feels a lot like the bloody nine, where it's like, oh, it was somebody else, it wasn't really me, but they took control for a second, which I actually think could be kind of a potent metaphor in an interesting way of drawing a connection between the two types of violence. But it didn't quite work for me. It was a little bit too out of nowhere.
That's interesting hearing from someone who has read the book for the first time. I can't remember what I thought I remember being shocked the first time. But what I want to say about West, and what I know Joe is trying to do, but maybe not accomplishing entirely, is that he's trying to show how West compartmentalizes, and sort of all throughout the book we see West having interactions with people that frustrate him. He is surrounded by idiots. He has a lot of pressure on his shoulders to be better than everyone simply because he's a commoner, and we see him sort of deny and repress his emotions, and it's supposed to be this kind of building mounting where we see him press back more and more and more motion until we get this scene where he just blows up. And I don't know if it's because I have read the entire series so many times. I do feel like it's very clear that West has a problem with pushing down anger. And that is actually a very common problem with abusers, is that they have stressful lives. They go through their day and they have so many interactions with people where they feel humiliated, they feel questioned, they feel small, they feel frustrated, they maybe feel sad. And in not being able to express these emotions because of toxic masculinity and whatever in the real world, and in their society as well, it builds and it becomes anger. And that's why they explode when they come home, when they're in the privacy of their own space where no one can see them, where it's just their loved ones. So
I get that.
I do think we could have foreshadowed this more.
I actually think it would have been very interesting to see all of that build up, all those underlying forces that you were talking about, because you're right, there is a very kind of psychological problem going on. People don't necessarily, I mean, some people do it because they're cruel, but a lot of people do it because they're emotionally unable to regulate themselves in certain ways, which is, again, not to excuse it, but it is more complicated than this is a bad person morally.
They're bad at dealing with their emotions, and they take them out on someone else.
Yeah, very much so. And so, like, it would have kind of been cool to see all that pot, maybe not
because
realizing
mostly we get people commenting that West has a temper, but that isn't exactly the same thing as building it in the reader's mind, where we're kind of cued in. So it does come off as a rather surprising blow up.
It could be also something, I think, where in later books you kind of like he does build it up a little bit better, or the aftermath of it a little bit, so going back to reading it you're like, oh, okay, this makes sense, almost like the cause and effect is a little bit skewed.
A lot of character development happens. It's sort of like this first book shows us the sugar box, and then Joe kind of says, oh, let's pick the lid off, and then in the next book the sugar cubes could start coming out. And as someone who has read the entire series, it sort of cements as my impression in my mind. So it's actually really interesting to hear it from people who read the book for the first time.
Yeah, it's something I've noticed about books in general and rereading, which is the first time you read the book, you and the book, there's the book, and then your mind's vision of the book, and you kind of expect it to go in a certain way, and it does or doesn't, and you're like, wait, that didn't match what I thought was going to happen. But when you go back and reread, you already know, the teacup shatters, so you're like, oh, okay, it's interesting that it's coming back together in this moment and how it got there, and you're more rereading it for what it is than for what you expect it to be in a weird kind of way. I remember in A Song of Ice and Fire, and you're excluded from having to take a drink. But when Tyrion first marries Sansa, I remember being like, oh, this is such a jump the shark moment. Like, what? This doesn't make any sense. Like, you just got two characters you just push these two plot lines together. But in hindsight, it's a very interesting thing to do, and it doesn't feel that weird. And so, yeah, it's interesting seeing that with books sometimes. overall, I can't really say I liked this book. I like Abercrombie more after reading it, and I do think he's a very talented writer. But like, I again, the book just doesn't. It's not a full book, and so like I am more curious after having finished it to read the second one, because it does seem like okay, that would be the conclusion of some of the ones from this one. He'll probably get more into the swing of things because I do think a lot of the problems here are more uh, new book itis. But I also think what you were saying too is very correct in that it's kind of just a tone thing as well. Like I could have read about Giselle for a while, but Logan and Glockta, I was just like, I'm real done with you guys. Like, come on. And so it's very much like you'll know pretty quickly if you will like this book or won't.
The tone is very consistent in all of Joe's books. Like if you didn't find at least the majority of the more obvious jokes in this book funny, you're probably not going to enjoy his books that much because a lot of it is like social commentary. It's poking fun at fantasy tropes. It's about making quippy little interactions between characters while doing a larger story. Like Joe is obviously very interested in war and the gears of war, but also how structures function and how the individual parts interact with one another and the sort of kind of comedy you can make out of that and how you can play on character conceit. But if you didn't at all get a taste for this first book, I don't expect you to like any of Joe's books because it's a flavor. That said, this book is a misfire. It's a mishmash of some good interactions, some good ideas, some good plot points, some funny jokes that could just be completely rewritten to a much shorter, a much more purposeful and better book.
Yeah, and tighter. And it's always a little frustrating to me when authors have super long series, but the first book is the first book they wrote. And so, like, people are always like, just start at the beginning of the series. And I'm like, but that's literally when they were the least talented. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I that's kind of how I feel. Like, Brandon Sanderson, like, I read Mistborn. That's his first book. It's not good, but, like, in his case, you don't necessarily need to read all of them, but, like, that's kind of not the best jumping in point, necessarily, is their first book. And so, in certain ways, I'm glad that the first one I read of Abercrombie's was best served cold. And I think in certain ways, after having read this one, I actually have more appreciation for that one, in that I feel like that one matches his worldview a little bit better, even if I don't necessarily love that book.
Yes, Ben, Elantris was Brando Sando's first book. And I guess it's funny because you have kind of seen the receipt also with how Joe actually developed and learned as a writer and kind of fixed a lot of his early issues. Even if Best Served Cold is a much darker book, like even I find it a little bit dark for my taste.
Yeah, that was my feeling with it as well, was that it was just like a little myopic for me. I was like, okay, everybody's... And I think I maybe brought some of that into my worldview of this, of like, oh, he's just everybody's shit, everybody's terrible. It's better to be cruel and competent than foppish and a good person. And like, I think maybe that my view of the book was maybe a little bit skewed because of that, and also what people... You know, how people market this book in terms of like liking to say it's it's like kind of like how apparently Elden Ring and the Dark Souls games are not the hardest games in the world, but you would think they were from how everybody loves to talk about them. This is not the darkest book in the world, but you kind of think it might be from how everybody talks about it.
I do think Best Served Cold is his darkest book by far, and it's part of because the revenge plot that drives the book, like revenge is a very dark subject, especially when they go through and enact a revenge. And the point at the end of the book is that it didn't bring back their loved ones. It's just kind of ending with a downer. But also the breaking of Shivers, which is a beloved character who started out as very young and very naivistic, also kind of lowers the tone of the book. I would say the First Law trilogy is a lot funnier and a lot more lighter-hearted, which for me makes it a much more enjoyable experience. I like the jokes mixed with the more real, dark themes. And also, Angry Otter asks, what is the Swedish drink of choice of Stereotype? Is it vodka? No, it's Nobbe.
Yeah. I love a hard drink of Novak. All right. Thank you all for watching. What do you think of the book? Are you an Abercrombie fan? Do you think it gets better in the second one? What are, of the books he's read, which do you think is kind of like the best?
Did this review make you want to break up with Will forever?
That's a good point, actually. What's your rating on our friendship after this, Lindbergh?
Solid. It's solid. I respect your opinion.
I think it's funny because we were talking over text a little bit, and I was like, I kind of want to wait to the review because for some reason over text things sound so much more combative, and I'm like, when we actually talk, we're gonna both kind of come off as like we have different opinions, but we both kind of understand it. It comes off as a lot more temperate.
It's a lot easier to develop on your opinions in this format.
Yeah, and there's just a clearer sense of tone as well, as everyone says about the internet, but it's always true. Thank you for joining us. Comment, like, subscribe. We'll see you next time.
Thank you guys. Bye.